Welcome to the fourth lecture in this module, and in this lecture I'm going to cover the use of cannabis-based medicines in a variety of different neurological disorders. And the conditions that I'm going to cover include epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson and Huntington's, which are both motor disorder diseases, Alzheimer's and dementia, autism, and ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So why do I need to know this? Well, this is really an area of up-and-coming research, and some of the strongest clinical evidence that we have for cannabis-based medicines is in epilepsy and multiple sclerosis, because these are the areas in which we have licensed medicines. So it means that these are the areas that we have the most clinical data in. But the use of cannabis-based medicines in other neurological disorders is a really up-and-coming area of research, and I think that in the short to medium-term future we'll see a lot more evidence coming out for cannabis-based medicines in other neurological disorders. Some of this has been facilitated by the fact that purified CBD has been recently approved for the treatment of rare forms of epilepsy. So there is ongoing research to establish whether purified CBD can be used in other forms of epilepsy, as well as in just broader other neurological disorders. There's an awful lot of research with purified CBD. Because it is now licensed, could we broaden the use of that product into other neurological disorders? This is also an area in which we see a lot of pediatric use. So all of the trials that have been carried out with CBD in epilepsy and in areas like autism and ADHD have been in children. And so this means that these are the areas in which we have evidence about the side effects and effectiveness of cannabis-based medicines in children. Whereas in many other areas we're looking at adult populations. So for each of the neurological disorders that I'm going to talk about, I'll start with a little overview about what that condition is, just for those of you who aren't familiar with these neurological conditions. So I'm going to cover epilepsy first, because this is the area in which we have an awful lot of evidence of the effectiveness of a cannabis-based medicine. So epilepsy is a neurological disorder that causes seizures or unusual sensations or behaviours. And it can be a generalized or focal, which means that it can be a condition that starts in a single area of the brain or across many areas of the brain. And the types of symptoms that patients experience are seizures, confusion, jerking, twitching, loss of consciousness, fear and anxiety. And this can lead to more severe symptoms as well, such as cognitive and behavioural problems, and it can be fatal. The epilepsy is the most common chronic neurological condition in children. It has an onset usually in childhood, but it can also occur in people over 60. And there are approximately 50 million people worldwide who suffer from epilepsy. So purified CBD, or pure CBD, is the compound which we know has efficacy in epilepsy. And this whole story started with anecdotal benefits reported by parents of children with severe epilepsy and drug-resistant epilepsy, that is, epilepsy which isn't treatable by standard anti-epileptics, found that CBD extracts, purified or CBD-rich extracts, were beneficial in reducing seizures and in their children with epilepsy. And this led to a large development program by GW Pharmaceutical to try and pursue that anecdote and carry out clinical trials. And they have done nearly 14 randomized controlled trials now and open label studies with Epidiolex, which is the name for the purified CBD solution that they developed. And they found that 13 of these 14 trials were successful at reducing seizure frequency in large patient numbers, because there's so many trials. Specifically, they found positive effects of purified CBD in refractory epilepsy. So that is epilepsy that isn't being managed by other anti-epileptic treatments. And there are multiple types of epilepsy which were found to be successfully treated by CBD. These trials also covered patients of all ages from 1 to 62 years of age, but when they went into the phase 3 trials, they really focused on childhood epilepsy in 2 particular rare forms of epilepsy so that they could pursue the orphan drug status of those diseases. Because Epidiolex has been around for quite a while now, we have some long-term data that shows that CBD remains effective nearly a year and a half after the treatment was started, and that on average people use a dose of between 20 and 25 milligrams per kilogram per day. So if you are a 50-kilo child, that equates to about a gram a day of CBD, and that the side effect profile of that CBD with long-term use is tolerable, and that the effectiveness of the drug doesn't diminish with time. So because there's been so many trials with Epidiolex now, we do have meta-analysis data that can show us with strength in numbers the effectiveness of the drug. So it is an oral solution. For those of you who are not familiar with Epidiolex, it's an oral solution that's delivered by syringe to give accurate dosing to account for different weights of different children. It has FDA and EMA approval, so that's the regulatory bodies in the US and across Europe and in many other countries, and in Australia now. Epidiolex has been approved on the basis of its clinical trial data for reducing seizures in these 2 rare forms of epilepsy called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. And very recently, it's just been approved by the FDA for another rare form of epilepsy called tuberous sclerosis. So these are all rare genetic disorders that are difficult to treat with standard anti-epileptic medications. There are 4 trials four phase 3 trials that have investigated the use of Epidiolex in these 2 rare forms of epilepsy that have been analysed by meta-analysis to look at the overall effectiveness of the drug. And in total, this covers more than 550 patients, and they found that there was a reduction in seizure frequency by at least 50% in nearly 40% of the patients. So that's really quite a very good success rate in patients for whom these seizures are traditionally really difficult to manage. And this was on a dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. That was the standard reduction in seizure. Epidiolex is being trialed in many other seizure disorders. So I mentioned it's just actually had regulatory approval for tuberous sclerosis, but there are other syndromes such as Rett syndrome and infantile spasms for which Epidiolex is now being investigated through clinical trial research to try and expand the number of disorders in which Epidiolex can be prescribed. So there is some anecdote that suggests that the combination of CBD and THC may be more beneficial than just CBD alone, and some parents would definitely be advocates of this idea that you need to have some THC present in order for the CBD to be effective, or that with time you need to add in THC and that CBD alone isn't effective. There is data of both a pro and an anti-epileptic effect of THC, which is related to dose. So at low doses, THC can cause a reduction in seizures, but at high doses, it can actually cause seizures. So you have a bit of a difficulty there with THC, and that has both pro and anti-epileptic effects, and dose is quite critical. So in terms of the clinical trial data so far, we just have some uncontrolled observational studies that have looked at various fixed ratios of CBD and THC in epilepsy. So this is either at a ratio of 20:1 or 50:1, with the 20 and the 50 being CBD and the THC just being the 1. So you're talking about CBD dominant products with a very small amount of THC present. And they found that these products were effective, like Epidiolex. They were effective at seizure reduction, and that's covering a total of nearly 150 patients. So when you're researching about this concept of which is better in epilepsy, pure CBD or CBD extract, you may come across this paper, which was published in 2018, which talks about the fact that CBD-rich extracts are superior than purified CBD. And they did a meta-analysis where they looked at all the clinical trial data, and this is both controlled and uncontrolled data, where either pure CBD or a CBD extract was given to the patients. And what they found was that the patients who received the CBD-rich extracts, so not the pure form, but the extracts that contain other phytochemicals present, tended to use a lower dose of CBD than those using the purified. So instead of an average dose of 27 milligrams per kilogram per day, those who were taking the CBD-rich extracts were using 6 milligrams per kilograms per day. And they also suggested that the adverse events, so the side effect profile of the CBD-rich extracts, was superior than the purified CBD. So the people who were using the CBD-rich extracts had fewer and less serious side effects than those using purified CBD. And so this is often quoted as a reason why people think that the CBD extract is better than pure CBD. However, there are a couple of things that I would like to draw your attention to with regards to this paper that I think should temper your opinion about whether or not you think this is true. So really, this study is comparing apples and pears. They are not comparing clinical trial data of the same quality. And I think without the first and second lecture of this module, you probably wouldn't fully realize this. So just to give you an example of a few of the things that they're comparing that aren't similar. And I also mentioned when we were talking about meta-analysis that really to do a meta-analysis, you have to have used the same drug in the same patients by the same trial type to be able to compare them. However, they are comparing clinical trials of very different design. So all of the data, all of the clinical trials that looked at Epidiolex were randomized controlled trials, whereas the studies that looked at the CBD-rich extracts were observational studies. And I told you in the clinical trial design lecture that observational studies or uncontrolled data tend to overestimate the efficacy of a drug and underestimate the dose that's required because you don't have a control arm. You don't have anything against which you are comparing your data that accounts for placebo effect within a medicine. So this is comparing observational uncontrolled data with controlled data. So that's one problem with this paper. The other problem is that you're looking at very different formulations. So CBD-rich extracts tend to be oils, whereas Epidiolex is a solution. And there are differences in how those are delivered. So oils are delivered by a sublingual route of administration, which is under the tongue, and the solutions are delivered orally. Now, there's quite a big difference in the bioavailability of CBD, that is the amount of CBD which gets into your bloodstream, by the sublingual versus the oral route. So we know that orally, probably only about 10% of CBD gets into your bloodstream, but sublingually, it's maybe 20 to 30%. So one of the major differences between these two types of medications in this meta-analysis could be just in terms of their bioavailability, in that the sublingual medications are going to have better bioavailability and get more CBD into your system than the solutions. And also the the oil solution itself probably has some gastrointestinal side effects just because of the fact that the CBD is dissolved in olive oil, and using that olive oil can itself have some side effects. So you're talking about medicines that are by different formulations with different routes of administration and different bioavailability. So really, we're not comparing apples with apples, we're comparing apples with pears. And in order to really fully establish whether a CBD-rich extract is superior to purified CBD, you would really need to do a head-to-head clinical study where you are comparing the two products by the same formulation, by the same route of administration, to fully establish which is superior. So there is quite a lot of up-and-coming clinical research in seizure reduction and epilepsy, and this is predominantly all using cannabidiol or a cannabidiol-rich product. So if we look at some of the studies that are currently registered, you can see that there are a number of different epilepsy disorders in which these products are being tested. So tuberous sclerosis, and also refractory epileptic encephalopathy. So different type of epilepsies are being looked at. Different types of formulations are being looked at. So for example, Insys Therapeutics have a spray of CBD, which they suggest would be superior to the oral solution version of CBD. Now, Insys Therapeutics actually went out of business recently, so I don't know what's happening with that CBD program at the moment. It may be licensed out to another pharmaceutical company. And then we also have some clinical trials registered which are looking at different ratios of CBD to THC. So this is an example, the last one there on the list is an example of a 20-to-1 product, 20 of CBD and 1 of THC. And these studies are varying with small patient numbers to very large patient numbers. You can see the phase 3 trial with Epidiolex in tuberous sclerosis has 210 patients. So I think in the future, if we look forward, assuming that a lot of this trial data is positive, what we'll see is that we'll have different types of CBD made by different companies that may be available for prescribing in epilepsy, in broader epilepsy types, rather than just those 3 rare forms of epilepsy for which CBD is currently licensed. So I think in the short to medium term future, more epileptic disorders will be treatable with CBD or a CBD-rich extract. So what about the scientific evidence that supports how CBD works in terms of being able to reduce seizures? So there is quite a lot of evidence to support this. So there's an awful lot of preclinical literature that's looked into the mechanism of action of how CBD or indeed other cannabinoids work. And like in the pain situation, there are a variety of mechanisms of action. So these compounds don't just work through one receptor, they work through several receptors, and the reduction in seizure is brought about through at least 3 different mechanisms. So there is a role for agonizing the CB1 receptor. So activating the CB1 receptor at low levels can have an anti-seizure effect. There's also a role for the TRPV1 ion channel, which, as I said, is one of the ion channels that's involved in pain transmission. It's often also quite important in seizure maintenance. And then there's another receptor called the GPR55 receptor, which is an orphan receptor. We don't know what activates it normally in the body, which is why it doesn't have a name. It's just called 55. But activation of or antagonism of GPR55 is also thought to be one of the main mechanisms by which cannabinoids have an anti-seizure effect. Something that we can learn through preclinical literature is that these compounds don't just reduce seizures, in epilepsy models, but they also improve survival rates. So the animals will live for longer because eventually seizures can be fatal, but cannabinoids have been shown to reduce seizures such that overall survival rates are improved in these animal models. There is overall neuroprotection, so because there are less seizures, they are protecting the brain from the damage that would be caused by seizures, and also the mechanisms that bring about those seizures are reduced by cannabinoids, which means that they're neuroprotective. There's also changes in behavior in epileptic models. So, for example, the cannabinoids can reduce depressive symptoms that are associated with epilepsy, and that's been shown through animal models. And it's also been shown through animal studies that cannabinoids can reduce the impairment in cognitive function, so in brain function, that can be caused by seizures and by chronic epilepsy. So there are many things other than just the seizure reduction that cannabinoids are beneficial for in models of epilepsy. And it's not just CBD that works and low-dose THC that works. There are other phytocannabinoids that have been proven to work in animal models of epilepsy, and these include cannabidivarin, which is CBDV. And CBDV was being pursued for a while by GW Pharmaceuticals in clinical trials, but actually their clinical trial with CBDV in epilepsy was halted midway through because it wasn't working. It wasn't causing a seizure reduction in patients. So they did halt that study, and CBDV isn't being pursued clinically anymore, at least by GW for epilepsy. But animal data and preclinical data does show that it works. Other compounds that work include cannabinol, CBN, cannabichromine, CBC, THCA, which is the acidic form of THC, and also THCV, tetrahydrocannabivarin. So these have all been shown to have anti-epileptic effects in animal models. And like the pain story, really we're trying to establish which of these compounds might be the best at reducing seizure and might have the best overall side effect profile, or the best drugability in a patient population. So which of these have the best physical properties that mean that they would make a good medicine. So I think the future looks bright in terms of using phytocannabinoids either individually or in combination in various ratios. And it may be that it's a combination of THC and CBDV that would be most effective in epilepsy. And that work is ongoing, trying to figure that out in more detail.